I work with one guy who is now divorced. And when I saw him, he was getting ready to get divorced. And he has never once told his wife what he was unhappy about. All the way through the divorce to this day, as far as I know, she has no idea why he left the marriage. And so I thought, it sounds like they're afraid to talk to their wives or girlfriends. And so I sort of tried it out with some guys and said sort of very tentatively, it kind of sounds like you're afraid to talk to her. And the reaction would be the same every time. First, they'd blow up, like I tried to drive the lane in a basketball game. It's like, oh, get that out of here, right? But within a minute, they would sort of sit back and go, that's an interesting idea. And then things would just start opening up. Through that lens, everything looked differently and made so much more sense when we would approach it with that idea in mind. Everything that had sort of not made sense started to make a whole lot of sense.
Welcome to the Paul Croswell audio experience.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. This is your host, Paul Croswell, and I'm excited to have you with us today. That was Dr. Avrum Weiss speaking a little bit about what led him to write his new book titled Hidden in Plain Sight: How Men's Fears of Women Shape Their Intimate Relationships. I know, very interesting title, but we're going to unpack it today. Now, let me ask you a question. Gentlemen, do you have a hard time having certain conversations with your wife, girlfriend, or just women in your life? And ladies, do you find that sometimes the men in your life seem to be avoidant of certain conversations? If you answered yes to either of these questions, then today's conversation might be especially insightful for you. Dr. Weiss is an award-winning author, speaker, teacher, consultant, and an experienced psychotherapist. He's nationally recognized for his pioneering work in developing the theory and application of experiential psychotherapy and his groundbreaking work in a comprehensive theory of change in individuals and organizations. He's also trained hundreds of psychotherapists in a more personal, relational model of psychotherapy. In his new book, which we unpack in today's conversation, he synthesizes his more than 50 years of experience and expertise. You don't want to miss this one. Dr. Avrum, welcome to the show.
Hi, good to meet you.
You as well. I've been looking forward to this. I know I said this before, but I've been looking forward to this conversation. From the title of your book, which we're going to dive into much later on, but the title of your book really caught me, and I'm interested in the thoughts and ideas behind it.
Yeah, I'll start right there because I had interesting conversations with the publisher who didn't like the title. They didn't want me to use the word scared because they thought it would put men off. And I said, I know it will put people off, but let's call it what it is and then deal with it.
Yeah. And like I said, we're gonna dive deeper into it in a little bit. I'm gonna leave the audience in suspense. You guys are in for a really good conversation, I think. But I like to start off each of these conversations simply by asking, how has your day been? How were you today?
My day has been fabulous. I have been out on the water in my boat until about 15 minutes ago, and there's no such thing as a bad day in a boat.
I love that. It's been a very long time since I've been on a boat. My goodness, maybe a year, 2 years ago now, my wife and I went whale watching while we were still living in New Jersey. But I mean, since then, I haven't been able to. So I'm a little bit envious.
I live on an island, so I get to go on. If I want to go anywhere, I have to go on a boat. So it's pretty common, whether it's my boat or the ferry. I'm on boats a lot.
Oh, that's amazing. So I want to jump into your story a little bit, right? You are what I'm going to call a classically trained psychotherapist who now you've gotten to the point where you're training other psychotherapists. How long have you been in the field of psychotherapy?
So I have an unusual story. I actually started working in the field when I was 17 years old.
Wow.
And so I am now 68. So the answer to your question is 51 years. I've been doing groups and working with men and
Yeah.
couples for 51 years.
That is, maybe it's just me,
Crazy.
but I find that very impressive. That's amazing.
It's either impressive or really boring that I just found. I mean, people today have such interesting careers. They do one thing for 10 years, then they do another thing, which I think is really interesting. And I just kind of found what I love to do, and I just kept doing it.
Yeah. So what initially interested you in the field of psychotherapy and kind of going in that direction?
Well, like most good therapists, I started off in my own therapy. And so I got into a therapeutic group program for kids when I was 17 and then was trained as a peer counselor. And I just thought it was amazing. I thought it was amazing that you could sit in a room with other people and say things that you wouldn't normally say and tell truths that you would normally, you've been taught not to say because they're not polite, but be real and straight and direct with people was just incredibly engaging to me. And, occasionally people will say, don't you get bored with your work, listening to people's stories? I'm like, oh my God, people are the most interesting thing on the planet. How could you, if you're bored, you're just not paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you look at almost all of human history, we've been storytelling
Oh yeah,
for as long back as we can see. Like we've been
absolutely.
sharing
Yeah.
stories and growing by sharing our stories and hearing other people's stories.
Well, best-selling book in the world, right, is a collection of stories,
Yeah. Yeah.
the Bible. Right.
Exactly.
And those stories were passed down person to person for I don't know how many centuries before somebody wrote them down.
Exactly. And it's just a part of us, I think.
Yeah,
So I love that perspective. I think that's a very, very healthy perspective to have,
I
especially
agree.
of what you do every day for the most part, right? Or at least
Yeah,
I don't know if it's an everyday thing now as
not
much
so much
as
every day, but still most days. Yeah,
yeah. So at some point in your journey, right? You've been doing this now for 50 plus years
yeah,
and walking with people and helping people
yeah.
navigate the complexities of life. And at some point in your journey you decided or you recognized that what you are learning should probably be shared to a wider audience, right? And that led you on a journey to becoming an award-winning author of multiple books, right? So you have a few different books, one titled Th- experiential psychotherapy. Sorry, excuse me. Change happens, living and loving mutually, and then
Yeah.
your most recent book, Hidden in Plain Sight. At what point did you realize, man, I think I might have some gems here that could be valuable, useful to a wider audience?
Well, I had the chance to kind of ease into it because my first book I wrote with my mentor. And so basically, my job was just to make sense of his wisdom. His wisdom was just sort of in a series of stories mostly.
Yeah.
And it was my job to take it all and put it in a structure and a form that was accessible to other people. So I didn't really have to think that I had anything to say because it was just my job. And then I wrote the second book I wrote was the book on change. And the reason I wrote it is that it's incredible, but there's really very little written about how change happens. And I say it's
Mm,
incredible because I'm in a field in which we're helping people to change every hour of every day, but we sort of just skipped over the step of developing a comprehensive theory of change. So that was my first sort of original contribution. And I was pretty anxious about the idea of putting my own ideas out there.
yeah, it's a scary step to take,
Yeah.
and whenever you actually start the writing process, you realize how incredibly vulnerable it
Yes.
is, as you're
Yes.
going through it, and how vulnerable you make yourself
Yeah.
as you, especially if you're engaged in hopefully serious writing where you're
Yeah.
deeply connected to what you're sharing. But I
And
want
then
to
just
go ahead.
to put a tail on that, then the current book, really, in the acknowledgments, I acknowledge the hundreds of men and thousands of hours that I've spent talking with them, because
Yeah.
again, it's almost like the first book. In this book, I'm really just listening to what men are saying, and helping them to articulate it. And that's what this book is. It's really just a compilation and a sort of deepening of what I've heard from hundreds of men over the last decade.
Yeah. Yeah. And, just a thought on something you said earlier before
Mm-hmm.
we get to that, because I really want to dive into that. The idea of change and the fact that there's not much written on it. I think even still today, I don't come across very many books that are specifically about change, how it happens and processing and
Right.
so on and so forth. Do you have any theories around why that is? Why is it just, we assume that people know and so we
Yes.
don't spend time, or
Yeah. We're I'm not going to go too deep into this because it'd be more interest to me and you than your listeners probably, but I'll say a little bit about it. The field of psychotherapy has had a sort of insecurity and inferiority complex from the very beginning. Freud was a pretty insecure guy. And so there's always been this sense of proving ourselves, like we're a real science. And so we overdo the science and we skip over the theory because we think it makes us more credible.
yeah, yeah. Wow, that just piqued my interest right there. I'm gonna probably end up doing some independent research on that, just the whole change
Okay.
thing. Um, so let's dive into your book, because I think this is a very interesting one. Again, you don't see these things coupled very often. Your most recent book is titled Hidden in Plain Sight: How Men's Fears of Women Shape Their Intimate Relationships. And it really got my attention, you know, uh, because
Yeah.
again, it does not couple, very often. You don't hear about this idea of
No.
men being afraid of women or the women
Yeah.
in their lives. Uh, you hinted to this a little bit, but what inspired this book? What made you decide to say, you know what, I think this should probably be a book and be put out there?
So I work as a therapist with a lot of men, which is unusual.
Yeah,
There are far more women who go into therapy than men,
yeah,
and so right away you're learning things as a therapist that other people. Certainly, I wasn't taught in graduate school, and I would listen to men, and they would go the same way again and again and again. So the men would come into my office, sort of very conflicted and ambivalent, and they would start telling me all the things they were unhappy about in their relationship. That was like their number one thing they wanted to talk about.
yeah,
And I would naively say, well, have you talked to your wife or your girlfriend or your partner? Have you talked to her about that? And they would look at me like I had just asked the stupidest question in the world. Like, no, stupid. If I could talk to her about it, I wouldn't be in your office. I mean, they literally were offended that I asked. But what that said to me is they didn't even consider that a possibility. That was
mm,
not even an option that they would talk to her. So I started thinking, well, why wouldn't they're so unhappy? I mean, I work with one guy who is now divorced. And when I saw him, he was getting ready to get divorced. And he has never once told his wife what he was unhappy about. All the way through the divorce to this day, as far as I know, she has no idea why he left the
wow,
marriage. And so I thought, it sounds like they're afraid to talk to their wives or girlfriends. And so I sort of tried it out with some guys and said, sort of very tentatively, it kind of sounds like you're afraid to talk to her. And the
mm,
reaction would be the same every time. First, they'd blow up, like I tried to drive the lane in a basketball game. It's like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah,
get that out of here. Right. But within a minute, they would sort of sit back and go, huh, that's an interesting idea. And then things would just start opening up as we, through that lens, everything looked differently and made so much more sense when we would approach it from with that idea in mind. Everything that had sort of not made sense started to make a whole lot of sense. So then I started writing about it because it seemed so important. And I went and, like a good psychologist, I went and read the literature, and I had to go back 120 years to find things written on the subject.
wow. Yeah, and it's, well, at least for me, it's I don't want to say, I don't think comforting is the right word, but I think maybe
Validating.
unsurprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, validating.
Yeah.
That's the right word. That even then it was not a very popular thing.
Because men are not supposed to be afraid.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. In the description of the book, you mentioned um, that this idea is actually a radical one. You know, when you talk about like a woman or women being afraid, generally speaking, right, of men for various reasons, it's like, oh, you know, it's
Everybody
goes
knows
in
that.
one ears and it gets
Right.
out the other. It kind of dismissed right away. No one really thinks second about it. But when you mention this idea of men being afraid, it's this really radical idea. Why do you think some men would be offended at this idea?
Well, there's why men are offended, and then there's why I'm going to add to your question and say why women are offended. So men are offended because in our culture, something that's being written a lot recently is something called fragile masculinity. And
Yeah.
what they mean by that is if you're born female, you identify as female from you don't wonder, am I really a girl? Am I female? Do I have to do anything to be female? You just are female. You don't have to do anything to be female. You just are for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
If you're born male, masculinity is something that is set out there for you to compete for and achieve. And not only do you have to earn it, but you can be fired at a moment's notice. And we fired, meaning judged to be not masculine. And in
Yeah.
our culture, if I said to you, what are 10 adjectives that describe a man? You'd probably have a hard time coming up with them. Although if I said, what are 10 attributes that define a woman, it'd be a lot easier. We
Hmm.
don't really have a picture of what masculinity is. We just define masculinity by what it's not, which is feminine. So in our culture, to be a man means not to be feminine. But the problem is, so we're telling all these guys, don't look feminine. But the
Yeah.
problem is that we decided that intimacy and tenderness and warmth and vulnerability and joy and sadness are all feminine.
Yeah.
So if you look like any of those things, then you stand at risk of being seen as not masculine.
Yeah. Yeah. That's 100% true. And I think right now we're seeing that come to a head in society where
Absolutely.
there's just constant conflicting ideas and thoughts and arguments around the topic of what it means to be masculine and what it means to be masculine in a healthy way.
And it's dangerous. It is
Yeah.
dangerous in that men are dying of what they call diseases of despair, which include addiction and suicide,
Mm,
motor vehicle accidents, and high risk behavior. Men are dying at a high rate. And it's dangerous to other people. If you read the journals or the writing of any of these people who are doing the mass shootings, first of all, they're almost always young men.
yeah.
And they're angry, bitter, and terrified of women.
Mm. Yeah. My thoughts are jumping into so many different places.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you know, for sake of not going on too big of a rabbit trail
Uh-huh.
for myself, earlier you mentioned this idea of, you know, when boys are born, there's this idea put on them to achieve
Yes.
masculinity.
Yes.
um and ultimately, you know, as you said, it boils down to somehow trying to avoid femininity. But can you elaborate a little bit on what it looks like what are some of the metrics that you've seen or heard or observed, um that society ask men to
Sure.
achieve masculinity?
I can tell you a great story. A
Sure.
colleague of mine, her name is Judy Chu. She's written a wonderful book called When Boys Become Boys.
Mm.
Chu is an interesting woman because she's a psychologist and she's a congresswoman. You may have seen her in the New York Times being arrested outside of the Supreme Court recently. So
Ah.
she's a very interesting woman. And Chu spent 2 years in a Quaker school studying a small group of boys, trying to understand exactly what you're talking about. When do they go from being sweet and warm and tender to being armored and tough and defended. And it seems to happen right about kindergarten, first grade.
Wow,
And
that young?
what's discouraging, yes, that young. What's discouraging is that the boys are adopting these hypermasculine defenses, but their parents are not teaching it to them. The parents are doing everything they can to not socialize the boys, but they pick it up in the world. They pick it up from their peers. So the boys in the school build a club. They get together at a club, and it's called the Mean Boys Club. And the criteria for membership is you have to hate girls. And she tells this story about a little boy in kindergarten. At the end of the year, the teacher says to every kid, you can lead the class in your favorite song of the year. And so this sweet little boy gets up in front of the class and he starts to sing a lullaby. And all the boys in the front row start making fun of him. And he says, no, I was just kidding. I didn't mean that. And then switches to the Marine Corps anthem. Because he understood that to be honest about what he really liked was to subject himself to shame and ridicule. And then he understood what was expected of him and what the price was if he didn't act like a 6-year-old boy, 5-year-old boy. He already understood, whoops, can't let that part of me show.
Yeah, like that's not acceptable.
No, I will be shamed and humiliated.
Yeah. And, the thought I'm having, and maybe this isn't even worth diving into right now, but it's just for anyone listening. And if you do want to speak on this, you're more than welcome to. Like, what's the depth of the danger? Because I think we're beginning to see some of it boil up right now in society. But what is really the depth of the danger of denying boys the ability to embrace both the warmth and tenderness that all humans are called to embrace, right? But also learn to be resilient, right? Learn to be protective of those around them and care enough to want to go ahead and protect those around them and fight for those around them. Like, there's a balance there that should be struck. And I think we haven't quite found that as a society yet.
Yeah, no, I love your question. It's a great question. I could talk the rest of the time on the dangers to men, but let me pick a simple one.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I think men's higher mortality, men die a lot sooner than women. And I think this is why, because, one of the costs is loneliness.
Yeah.
That men are socialized to pursue careers, not relationships. And typically, either when they get divorced or they reach middle age and they look around and go, well, I don't really know anybody. And so I wrote an article about men and loneliness for Psychology Today that has had 1 million views. And I'm not saying that like, oh, look at me. I'm saying like, wow, 1 million people jumped on and were interested in an article about men and loneliness. And so we know that loneliness makes people unhappy. We know that loneliness is as big a health risk as smoking cigarettes. So I think that's one of the ways that men are less healthy and don't live as long because of what we're talking about.
And I said, but I actually don't think a lot of people know that.
Yeah.
That loneliness is as unhealthy as smoking cigarettes.
It is. It's as big a contributor to early mortality as smoke. So when you go to your doctor every year, your doctor says, how much do you drink? And how do you smoke? And they ask you all these questions related to your health. But only once in my life have I heard a doctor who said, and how are your relationships? Do you have people to talk to? Do you have friends? If he or she were doing their job, that would be just as important to talk about as whether you smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol.
Yeah. Like my I don't think I've ever gotten that question from any doctors I've seen. And, I have a condition that causes me to actually go in often. So I've seen a lot of doctors over my life. I've never gotten that question. My therapist would ask me that,
but your doctor should be.
And that makes perfect sense. And something you said got me thinking, and I promise we're gonna jump to the book after this
Well,
one.
we're talking about the book this whole time.
Oh, good. Sometimes I feel guilty because I'm like, man, I just want to dive a little bit deeper into your knowledge.
This is all in the book. All this is in the book.
I love it. But we talked about the idea of loneliness, and you said it in terms of, they look around at some point and realize they don't know anyone. But I'm wondering, is the loneliness more so from not feeling known as opposed to not knowing everyone because they've never opened themselves up?
I think it's really good point you're making. And absolutely, that's true. If you ask men, do you have friends? They will always tell you yes. But you have to ask the follow-up question. The follow-up question is, no. I mean, by friend, I mean somebody you talk to about the things that bother you. And then they're like, oh, well, no, I don't have that kind of friend.
Yeah.
But it's part of what is part of the stress on modern marriages is that because men don't have other relationships, all their eggs are in the basket with their partner. And it puts a great deal of stress. If you haven't seen it, and for your listeners, Google Man Park Saturday Night Live. There's a wonderful skit they did where the wife comes home at the end of the day and the man has been working from home and he's just like desperately lonely and he just starts pestering. So how was your day? What did you do? How was your lunch? And she's going crazy. And she says, honey, I've got to take you to the Man Park. So she takes him by the hand and takes him to where all these guys, and she's like, okay, go ahead, honey, you can play with them, make a friend. And so they're like tentatively approach. So this skit went viral.
Yeah.
Because it's so close to home. And so women know that men don't have relationships and are always trying to, they set up play dates for their husbands the way they set up play dates for their kids.
Yeah. Admittedly, like I have a few very, very close friends. Then, by very close, I mean, actually, we open up, we talk to each other, which is healthy.
That's great.
But there have been plenty of seasons in my life, during the course of my marriage, where my wife has confessed to me, she's praying for a friend for me in that season.
That's very common.
She sees something that, I don't see.
Right.
Or I suppress.
The sad thing is that little boys are as close with their guy friends, and the friendships are as important to them as girls' friendships with girls. But obviously something changes because we go from being very, very close and connected and tight to being very distant. The only time I've been arrested in my life, I was in high school. And I had my first really close male friend, and we're sitting in a car in front of his house.
Yeah.
And we're talking, and hours and hours and hours go by, and we're just talking. And I turn the car off because we're just sitting there talking. Well, cops came by and arrested us because I think they thought we were having sex because they couldn't imagine two guys in a car talking. We must be doing something wrong. So they actually brought us to the police station and arrested us for sitting in the car and talking.
That is wild.
Yeah.
That's so wild. And that screams, about where society is and how society is set up in terms of actually encouraging healthy masculine relationships, like male relationships, right? Yeah. That is so crazy.
Well, I'll tell you another part about that. I started running therapy groups for men about 10 years ago. And when I remember the night when I was getting ready to go into the room to do my first group, and I thought, Avrum, this is the worst idea you've ever had as a psychologist. They're going to talk sports. They're going to talk business. Well, at the end of the first group, guys are hugging each other. Yeah. At the end of second or third group, guys are talking about loving each other.
Yeah.
And what I learned, and I've been doing this now a long time, what I learned is that I thought men were just emotionally withdrawn and emotionally unavailable and they don't want to talk. It is not true. No. It's that they're scared of women. So they look that way when there are women in the room. But when you take the women out of the room and you just let guys talk with each other, they're unbelievably, we're passing the tissues around. People are crying. People are hugging. People are talking to each other about how important they are in their life. It's really been an eye-opener.
If you struggle to reach the goals you set for yourself, the good news is it's most likely not because you're lazy or that you lack discipline. Statistically speaking, you're most likely struggling to reach your goals because your life is out of balance. In 2017, the Harvard Business Review reported that the United States spends more than $190 billion with a B, billion dollars to address the physical and psychological effects of burnout in the average working professional. And these numbers are from before the pandemic, so who knows what it is now. The point is, anyone trying to reach a goal while navigating burnout, whether consciously or subconsciously, is not set up to succeed. This was my experience until I discovered the life balance approach to reaching your goals and changing your life. This approach to reaching your goals takes into account your life balance as you work towards your goals. Subsequently, it basically guarantees success for almost any goal you're trying to reach. And I know that is a big promise, but it is very much realistic and very much possible. In my best-selling book, Life Balance, I outlined the principles of this formula. And due to popular demand, the online course for the book is now available. In this course, I walk you through each and every principle individually and how to apply it to your life. It's a self-paced course, so you can take it on your own time and go through it as quickly or as slowly as you would like. Every purchase includes a digital copy of my book, Life Balance, the Life Balance workbook in PDF format, and the Life Balance planner, also in PDF format. For a limited time, you can purchase this course at 50% off when you use promo code PODCAST. To purchase this course today, visit paulwcroswell.com. Now let's get back to the episode. I wonder how much of that is connected to the desirability expressed by women, for certain men, right? So just the idea of, so when you watch a movie like Jason Bourne, and here is this very masculine, tough, like he is the man's man, right? In many regards. And so there's this overwhelming expression just generally from I'm going to say women in general, right, across the board of, man, we love that. We want that in a man. And so a man watches that and they see the reaction of their spouse, their girlfriend, or their sisters or whoever, and they go, oh, well, that's kind of what I need to be in order to be desired, in order to be accepted. And so I'm just kind of processing all of that now.
Yeah, no, you're right on. You're spot on. There was a article in the Times some years ago. They interviewed boys about how they learned about sex.
Yeah.
And overwhelmingly, boys learn about sex from watching pornography. Mm-hmm. And then they are unbelievably confused because in the porn videos, the guys are like Jason Bourne. They're dominant, they're controlling, they're aggressive. But then the girls that they're interested in are saying, talk to me, be sensitive, be open. Yeah. But then they're not attracted to that. And so it's a big mess that is extremely confusing to boys and young men.
And I think that spells out the necessity of this book, I think, perfectly.
Thank you, but I would say that more broadly and say the necessity of this book and the necessity of taking this problem seriously.
Yeah.
That, one of my closest friends told me that it was irresponsible of me to write this book, that I should not write it.
Interesting.
Because he is worried, actually he still is worried, that the book will be taken as justification for bad behavior by men, that men are the perpetrators. You can't write a sympathetic book about, you have to write a book that blames men and criticizes men and says what's wrong with men and what men have to do to get better. And if you write a sympathetic book about men, then men will see that as, see, I don't have to change. I'm just scared. It's not my fault. But if we don't work with men, there's a fabulous quote from Martin Luther King, which somehow got lost in history because I've never seen it written anywhere other than where I found it. But King said a very bold thing. King said, segregation scars the soul of the perpetrator as much as the victim.
Wow.
It's an intense thought. And so if we don't try to understand men and what goes on, if we just demonize them and criticize them and blame them and say they're inadequate and they don't know how to do relationships and this, that, and the other, first of all, they're not going to therapy.
Oh, no. No.
Because we've basically said, well, this is not a place where you're going to be understood. This is a place where you'll be judged. So they're not going to get help. It's not going to get better. And so I appreciate what you say about my book, but my book is just a small part of a larger movement of people who are trying to work to understand men.
Yeah. A necessary part, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If we're going to get anywhere, one of my favorite feminist writers said, we're never going to fix the patriarchy. There's only one thing to do to fix the patriarchy. Men have to raise children. If men are equally involved in raising children, that's the end of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to pick that thought apart now. But I do have another question for you.
That's fine.
More specific. Some of the fears that you mentioned that men have when it comes to women includes the fear of being dominated and controlled, the fear of being trapped, the fear of being feminized, which we talked a little bit about, the fear of being inadequate or abandoned. And you listed a few others. And the question that kind of came to mind, well, two questions, well, a few questions actually, but the first is those conclusions, and are those from observations, or there's some research?
Thousands of hours of listening to men talk. And then that's just how it made sense to break it out to me. And also reading what's in the culture. So there's a chapter heading that's a lyric from a Lyle Lovett song. I think I can quote it. The preacher asked me, that the preacher asked her and she said, I do. The preacher asked me and she said, he does too. So you look anywhere and you see this stuff. It's so in the culture.
Yeah. And, whenever I have conversations about things like this or something similar with men, the closest I'll ever get, or I have ever gotten to a confession of fear, is the fear of self. Like, I don't fully embrace my emotions or indulge my emotions because I'm afraid that if I do, whether it's something I say or something I do, I'll end up doing something I regret, or saying something I regret. Where do you find the distinction, if there is one, between the fear of women and the fear of self?
Well, they certainly, it's a great question. They overlap a great deal. So for example, a good example, one of the fears that I talk about is men's fears of emotions in women. And the reason, and we see this all the time, because when men and women argue, men are always trying to make the conversation not emotional. Calm down. Don't get upset. Just be rational. Well, why are they doing that? Why is it so important to men to take all the emotion out of the argument? Well, first of all, they're not as good at it as women.
Yeah.
So they're trying to get a home court advantage, right? They want to play on their turf, which is the more rational, linear turf. But the other thing is that emotions are contagious. If you go to a movie and it's a sad movie, you get sad because we feel, we resonate with other people. So when men are in arguments with women and women get emotional, it makes men feel more than they're comfortable feeling. So they're trying to shut down the woman, not so much to shut her down, but to manage their own emotional dysregulation. They're trying to soothe themselves by silencing the woman.
Mm. And what would be, so for a man who's listening right now and he's going, man, you've just described me. Like I've literally said verbatim what you have said just now.
Can't tell how many times I've heard that.
And so he's listening. He's like, okay, clearly I'm caught and I'm guilty of that. What do I do? How do I start to fix or adjust that?
I'm happy to say I have an answer. And it was really important to me that this be in the book. So the last section of the book, the last 3 chapters are about what to do about it. So there's a chapter for men about what you can do about your part. There's a chapter for women about what you can do about your part. And then there's a chapter for couples. And there is also a link to a Facebook group, because the chapter for men has guidelines for men about how to find other guys who might like to talk about this with you.
Yeah.
And get together and form a support group. Get the book, start like a book group and read the book together, but then hopefully stay together and keep meeting once a month or whatever you want with other men who are interested in being open and close and connecting. So there are some pretty concrete guidelines in that chapter for men. And then there's a Facebook page for people who are doing this and want to, hey, do you bring wine to your group, or what day of the week do you find works best, or how did you find people, or whatever they want to talk to each other about, and I'll answer any questions in the group. So for men, the main thing I want to say is don't start by trying to talk about this with your wife. Find other men to talk about it with first.
Yeah.
Get a little more fluid and familiar with talking about your own feelings with the help of other men, and then bring your wife into the conversation. And a great thing for couples to do, which a lot of people are doing, is to read the book together.
Yeah.
Read a chapter. Don't go ahead. Just read one chapter, make a time to talk about it. Read the second chapter, make a time. Because for women, it's a very long answer, I'm sorry. If you look on Amazon, there are a ton of books written about how to understand men.
Mm-hmm.
They're all written by women.
Yeah.
So women find us an enigma. They don't understand us. We don't make any sense to them, and we're not very good at explaining. So the book can be really helpful, because when couples read it together, guys can say, yeah, like that. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah, that's how I feel. It can really help them to be open about things that they might not have even known were there.
Yeah. And
So
I think that's
very present.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you brought up too, because while this is a book, about men, it's not a book that's just for men,
No,
right?
absolutely not. No, in fact, I get as much mail from women as maybe more, saying, this has been really helpful in our marriage. I've learned so much. Mostly what women say to me is, I've been pissed off at my husband for years. And reading this book, I'm less angry and I'm more compassionate, because he doesn't tell me what's going on with him. But reading the book, I start to understand, and I feel more compassionate, feel more friendly. And then, of course, he gets less scared and starts. So if she gets less angry, he gets less scared and starts opening up more, which is what she wanted all along. So then, it starts going the other way.
Yeah. And one of the things that's often a hurdle for, I'm going to say more specifically for men when it comes to arguments within intimate relationships, is finding the right words to say what they want to say.
Yeah.
And a big part of what you're offering with the book is common language.
Yes.
It's giving them language that they would feel comfortable and validated using.
Yes.
And it would actually make sense to their spouse when they say it.
Yes. Yeah. It's like it says in chapter 7, yeah. So the other thing I'm doing, which I'm really interested in, and your readers may be interested in, is I'm starting to do workshops around the country for men and women to understand each other better. And one of the
tell
things,
me about that.
Well, if anyone listening is interested, if you're church or you're a member of the Lions Club or whatever, you'll see in the book, I think you'll give people my website and they can reach me. So it's basically teaching men and women how to talk to each other. So one of the things I'll do is I'll present a scenario that every couple's been in, the kind of argument and then I'll ask the women to write down what they're thinking on index cards. And I'll ask the men to write down what they're thinking on index cards. And then I'll read some of them, because people don't necessarily want to say it out loud. So I'll read some of them. And then, of course, women are learning about what men are really thinking, and women are learning about men are learning about what
women are really thinking.
And it is so eye-opening. Everybody learns even though, we've been living with each other, men and women have been living together since the beginning of time, it's incredible how little we understand about each other.
Yeah. And I'm gonna jump back to a few things that were
Mhm.
mentioned that I think would be very helpful. Um, well, helpful in general. The
Uh-huh.
first is, you talked about the importance of not starting with trying to have uh, these conversations, with your girlfriend
Right.
or wife, um, and what I wanted to bring up was the difficulty that some people find in finding friends as an adult.
Absolutely.
That seems to be more and more often. I'm having conversations around that, and it's just a struggle. A lot of
Yes.
folks are feeling like I have no idea where to start, and for that, I do just want to echo what you said in the group that you offer. I believe you said Facebook group, right?
Yeah.
This is such a powerful and simple way to make
Yes.
new connections, healthy connections around like-minded people as an adult. It
Absolutely.
takes so much of the pressure off.
I think it's Great Britain that has a cabinet level position, a minister of loneliness, believe it or not.
Wow.
And this one of the most effective treatments we've come up with for substance abuse yet is in one of the Scandinavian countries, I think Denmark, who have greatly reduced the rates of teen alcoholism by opening community centers and giving the kids a place to hang out and be together. So we
Yeah.
don't, I don't want to put you on the spot, so I won't ask you how many of your neighbors do you know. But most people's answer to that question would be,
Yeah. I'll tell you, I know one of my neighbors right now,
right,
and a part of the reason, like I said, we literally just moved into the area and
yeah,
it's a new development, but don't know any of them
right,
really, just one,
right,
and that's and by no, I mean we have spoken to a few times
right.
this neighbor.
Hardly no, right,
Yeah, it's not like we're having dinner even. So yeah,
right. Yeah, and it's terribly
it's spot
sad.
on.
And people want, in my experience, people are moving more and more to small towns. I know all of my neighbors extremely well. I'm in and out of their homes on a regular basis. They're in and out of my home on a regular basis. And that is the number one reason I moved here, because I want to live someplace, especially in COVID, where, the kinds of things people can do that are very simple are, like, go to the same dry cleaner. Don't go to different dry cleaners. Go to the dry cleaner and talk to the person who works there. Go to the same deli, go to the same grocery store, talk to the person at the check, develop a network of people. And although they're not deep relationships, you'll be surprised at how satisfying it is. And then you'll want to go to that store because Fred works there.
Yeah.
Fred makes a great roast beef sandwich. I'm going to go I'm not really even hungry, but Fred makes a great sandwich. I'm going to go, it starts to make a life.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it creates micro outlets
Yeah,
throughout your day and throughout the week
absolutely.
and so on as you're navigating life to have these deep relationships in different areas as you're navigating your daily life, right? Because now when you go and talk to Fred, it's not a shallow transactional
Right,
conversation.
right.
It's a genuine catch up. There's
Yeah.
openness, there's vulnerability there, and I think my wife and I were having this conversation, I think last night or this morning. It was around the idea of grief and the fact that a lot of times when people talk about grief, it's mentioned in this ethereal, emotional, non-tangible way, like you're processing grief, but there are biological changes and effects that it has on the body, where
Absolutely.
it is a physical process as much
Yeah.
as it is emotional. And whenever we are navigating strong emotions, it is as much physical as it is
Yes.
intangible.
Yeah.
And I think more if more people understood that, and I'll
Mhm.
say men specifically, I think if more of us
Yeah.
understood that, we wouldn't be so afraid of processing them,
I agree.
finding people and ways to process them
I
healthy.
agree. And I'll tell you another interesting thing about that. Um, it's universal. If I take a
Mhm.
picture, if I say to you, Paul, make a sad face, and I
Yeah,
take a picture of your sad face, and I go to Antarctica, and I go to China, and I go to Borneo, and I show them your face, everybody everywhere around the world goes, oh, that's a sad person.
yeah,
which is really interesting. There's no cultural barriers. So you can be with any human being anywhere. And if you're compassionate and you're open, you will understand how they're feeling. We're wired to understand how someone else is feeling.
Yeah. And that is really interesting.
Isn't it?
I've never heard it put that way before. We're wired to understand how someone else is feeling.
Yeah, in the book I talk about what's called the still face experiment, which is a famous social psych experiment. They took moms and babies, little babies, and they did a split screen. And there's a conversation, even if they don't talk. But the baby makes a silly face, and mom laughs, and the baby. There's a back and forth going on. They're communicating.
Yeah.
And the moms are instructed to turn away and turn back with just a still face, not angry, not critical, just not responsive. And within a minute, the babies are completely a mess. 1 minute of mom not responding. Some of them lost control of their bowels. They were so upset.
Wow. So
we do that back and forth without even realizing it all the time. We're always communicating and reassuring each other. Yeah, it's like you're nodding right now. Well, you're letting me know I'm listening to you, I'm with you, and I'm seeing that you're nodding. And so I know that, okay, this is working. Yeah. Paul gets me. We do that all the time. And when we stop doing it, we kind of fall apart.
Yeah. And I think the danger is that we've come to believe that we grow out of those things, and we don't. Like we grow out of the necessity for that kind of validation, that kind of interaction, and we don't.
No, I think I can safely say at 69, we do not grow out of it.
And so you mentioned babies, and it triggered my thought to jump back to this for just a moment, and then we'll land this plane in a few minutes. But you mentioned the idea of men becoming engaged in raising children, and the potential possible impact of that. Potential positive impact of that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I think that's worth breaking down.
A lot of men. So in a traditional family, which is almost non-existent now, but in a traditional family where men left the home to work and women stayed at home. My dad wouldn't have had to change a diaper or cook a meal if his life depended on it. If my mother left my dad, he was starved to death, right? So he didn't. I remember one time my dad came to me and said, "You want to go toss a baseball around?" And I was like, it was so weird because he'd never done anything like that with me. And it's like, what, did you read a book or something? Why did you? So what happens is for boys, their primary emotional connection is with their moms, is with a woman. So now go back to the still face experiment.
Yeah.
So their attention is riveted on their mom, and nothing is more important than pleasing her, because without her validation, I fall apart. So I watch her carefully, and I pay attention to the parts of me that she likes and the parts of me that she doesn't like. The things I do, she likes. The things I do, she doesn't like. And the things she likes, I do more of. Yeah. And so I'm worried about not pleasing her. And then I grow up, and if I'm heterosexual, I'm interested in women. And the same thing happens. I watch her like a hawk, and I'm dependent on her. And if she's not happy with me, somebody said to me the other day, happy wife, happy life. Kids, we say, if mom ain't happy, nobody's happy. And then you grow up and it just becomes happy wife, happy life.
Yeah. That is wild. And, you can see the inherent danger in, men not getting either the help they need or seeking the help they need to actually grow out of this, so that it's not just a cycle created.
But that I want to take the blame for that. I don't want to blame men for that, because I think we, meaning therapists, have done a terrible job at making therapy attractive to men. So I wrote an article about what's men in psychotherapy, what's in it for you. And some of the things I said are, by the way, most people in therapy make more money. And you know how you're always pestering your wife for sex? She's going to be more interested in sex. And you know how you feel alienated from your kids? You're going to be closer to your kids. And you know how you feel like you don't have your friends? So just very concrete. And men don't know this. Men think that going to therapy is just something to please their wives. And so I think we need to do a better job at saying to men, you're going to like this. This is going to make a lot of things easier in your life and you'll be a hell of a lot happier. We need to sell it.
Yeah.
No,
And
we need to sell it to men.
And it's been a long journey to destigmatize therapy overall, I think.
Yeah.
And I agree with you 100% that it had there's been no intentional, appeal to men for it, especially when you consider the popular images that culture portrays of men, right? How many of the Jason Bourne movies do you see him sitting down with the therapist? Right? You just don't, you know. And I go back to that movie because it's one of my favorite movies, but it's just a very clear example of what we're talking about.
And men are especially reluctant to go to couples therapy because why? Because it's going to be 2 against 1. Because the therapist is most likely going to be a woman, and men are anticipating that they won't be understood, that the therapist will understand their wife naturally and sort of take her side, and that they'll just now be 2 people telling me I'm wrong.
Yeah. So I guess this would be my my last question, no promises, what are some of the ways that you would suggest, maybe to other therapists that are potentially listening, that they can go about making therapy, or maybe in general that society can go about making therapy look more attractive to men, or at least make it not feel like such a risk for them?
Well, I want to go on a little bit. I'm going to indulge in a little bit of a rant about that.
Go for it.
I was approached by an organization who asked me if I wanted to do a workshop for them. I sent them a proposal and they said, oh, no, this doesn't emphasize diversity and inclusion enough. I'm like, really? Have you looked in the psychotherapy world? When you're talking about men in psychotherapy, that's a minority. So first of all, we have to start thinking about men. Just because they're privileged and in an advantaged position does not mean that we can just assume we know what it's like for them. So we need more people writing about the psychology of men. And we need, you can't get a PhD in psychology without studying minorities, essentially, without studying culturally sensitive work. We have to include masculinity in that. You need an education. So right now, that's pretty much what I'm doing most of my time, is going around. And if there are therapists listening, please talk to the people in your professional organizations about having me come in as a speaker and talk about men.
Yeah. And I love that, because there clearly is a lot of public discourse around toxic masculinity and what that is, what it looks like, how it shows up, and so on and so forth. But if there aren't any trainings or required trainings in that vein of how do I walk with, so if a man were to walk into an office right now and go, well, I'm convinced that I'm living toxic masculinity, I've learned that, I'm living that out, can you help me? Have you had any specific training,
exactly,
or to say, hey, yeah, I do have a clear idea of how to walk with you?
Yeah, but we need to provide that training, and we need to talk to therapists about needing that training. If a therapist decides they want to work with alcoholics, they wouldn't think about just going and starting to do that. They would go get training and work with alcoholics. If they decide they want to work with abusive people, they would go get training. Well, how come you don't need training to work with men? Why is that any different? I don't think it is.
Yeah. Well, your book is a great start to that. And
thank you.
Maybe, just maybe, there's a textbook somewhere in the future by Dr. Avrum that's going to be, become kind of a starting manual, so to speak, on that.
Yeah, I think this book comes close to that. I think the book is written for the general public, but there's a lot in it that therapists could learn about what we're talking about. It would be at least a good starting place. And there's certainly a lot of references in it.
Yeah. Well, Man, I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Me
I think
too.
we've come to a very natural stopping point. So I'm gonna ask you this: where can people find you if they want to connect with you or
Sure.
find out more about your work or anything like that?
Go to my website, which is Avrum Weiss, PhD, AVRUM WEISS, PhD.com. You will find links to my books. You will find links to my writing, other writings like my Psychology Today blog. And if you sign up for my mailing list, you will get a free ebook called Life Lessons Learned. So I will
Wonderful.
then send you articles as I write them, and I usually write something every couple of weeks. Mostly it's about men and couples, and you will get those articles and the book.
That's wonderful. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be including all of your links in the
Great,
description of this episode. So if you're listening and
great.
you're like, okay, I definitely want to take action on that and I want that free ebook, you can pause right now and go ahead and visit the website
Yep.
and sign up so that you can
And
go ahead and get that.
and I'll say one other thing because I'm going to brag for just a minute, and because I'm proud of this. I answer every email I get, and I answer it within 24 hours. And if you write me and you don't hear back from me, you can assume I didn't get your email, because if I got it, I would answer it. And I don't care how many emails I get in a day. I hate it when people don't answer my emails and they think they get too big for their britches and they don't have to talk to people anymore. So if you write me, I will write you back.
I love it. I love it. And I can say personally, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, it's been a pleasure having you
Me
on,
too. I
Dr.
enjoyed
Avram.
talking to you.
Same here. Guys, that is it for this episode. I hope you have gleaned as much from this as I have. Uh, Man, have a wonderful day and go back and listen to this again if you feel like you didn't catch everything. Take care. That's it for today's episode. I truly hope you enjoyed the show. To learn more about today's guests, including the links and resources related to everything we discussed, visit the podcast page at paulwcroswell.com, where you can find the entire podcast archive, as well as information about my book titled Life Balance, as well as the Life Balance Planner, and much, much more. If you'd like to support the podcast, the easiest and most impactful thing that you can do is subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. Also, leaving a positive review or comment is also important and greatly appreciated. Sharing the show or your favorite episode with friends or on social media is, of course, awesome and very helpful. Finally, for podcast updates, special offers on the Life Balance Planner, online courses, and more, please subscribe to our newsletter. You can find a link to do so in the show notes.